welcome everyone. Wanted to introduce a new speaker that we're meeting with today to kind of talk a little bit more about that cybersecurity side. So, again, my name is Jim Heron. I'm with Hummingbird.tech, and as a managed service provider, a technology support company that we are, oftentimes we get those cybersecurity questions. So, I have with me today Madison Horn on this conversation, and just really someone that has spent an abundant amount of years in the cybersecurity space. So, Madison, I'm going to do an introduction. If any of it sounds out of line, feel free to edit. It's just
I'm
as
sure you'll
needed.
crush it. I'm sure you'll be crush it.
So, Madison has built a career in the cybersecurity space, having spent more than 10 years working in that environment. Um, she's worked for a number of well-known consulting firms, lending her expertise in cybersecurity and helping them to adopt best practice standards to a variety of firms. In the last 3 years, Madison was called to serve and pursue a seat in the U.S. Senate, attempting to represent the state of Oklahoma in the 2022 Senate election. She currently sits on the advisory committee of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, whose mission is to educate legislators and policymakers worldwide on the hazards and roadblocks that they must navigate in the 21st century. She is the founder and CEO of Rose Rock Advisory Group. Madison, how did I
You crushed it. My favorite color is green, also.
do?
Important details here.
Well, I appreciate you jumping on this call today. Like I mentioned in our previous conversation, so many times when we sit across the table from business owners locally in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and throughout the state, they often have this question about where does cybersecurity live and how do we navigate that? So, reaching out to individuals like yourself and lending on your expertise to help us be more effective in the way that we present it, as well as just kind of bridge that knowledge gap that you and I both have when it comes to the cybersecurity landscape and where the conventional business owner is. I mean, a manufacturer that's got 100 people, he's not necessarily thinking about where does cybersecurity evolve and what does chat GPT mean for me and all this kind of stuff. So, I appreciate you joining me today. I have a few questions. If you're good, I can just kind of jump into them and, you can tell me how we can best address these.
Certainly, let's rock and roll.
All right. So, obviously, like I mentioned during the introduction, you've spent the last 10 years working in the cybersecurity space. How has that evolved in your perspective from, 2013 to today?
Sure. So let's start with just the basics. This might sound like a funny story, but it's very relevant. I think that it was 4 or 5 years ago, I saw my first Super Bowl commercial that was a
The
cybersecurity
QR
company.
code. Oh,
No,
okay.
it was a cybersecurity vendor who bought a spot during the Super Bowl. I was like, wow, did cybersecurity just become mainstream? I mean,
Right.
when I first entered the world of cyber, then the consultants that offered me a job, then they came to me and said, "Do you want a job in security?" And in my mind, I was like, "Well, I'm only 5'6". I don't think that I would be very good at that." And they had to say, "No, no, 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 cybersecurity," and I was equally as confused. And so, I bring this up because, cybersecurity is finally becoming more mainstream. And I
Sure.
think that that is due to a number of reasons, but the I would say the overarching industry is doing a better job. We still certainly struggle with,
Hmm.
translating the technical requirements to business requirements and kind of getting out
Right.
of that jargon. But I do think that we've made leaps and bounds in just getting into the public eye. And so that
Right.
people are becoming more aware of what the industry is, what's its purpose, what's its intent, and how it can work alongside the business
Right.
versus being an impeding, you know, roadblock to the business. So
Right.
I would say those are huge changes that I've seen over the past 10 years. I would say, obviously, working in the critical infrastructure space, then,
Right.
we've first saw cybersecurity tools emerge for financial services, your standard
Yep.
enterprise.
Absolutely.
Um, and now we're starting to see tools that are so much more tailored to the industry. And I would say that OT space is that new frontier that people are
Yeah.
still trying to learn and kind of figure out, given the various number of different asset models and how different it is from the IT space. But
Right.
it is phenomenal to be seeing the industry so tailored and regulation actually catching up to the industries as well.
Yeah. So you said the Super Bowl. Did you have the same angst that I did 2 years ago when that QR code just flashed up on the screen?
Of how many people are going to use this and what the heck is it actually linked to? Yes,
Yes.
yes.
You all just
Someone
gave a
has said,
foothold to your network.
exactly. You're welcome, China. I shouldn't joke about that during this current time, but yeah, there was a
Right.
mild panic, and everyone that I was sitting there with, and they pulled out their phone, and then I looked at them. I think they were all immediately embarrassed.
That's outstanding. Um, well, so I'm going to pivot again, just completely away from
Sure.
that. With you having pursued federal government, can you speak to where the government's role has been in terms of setting that standard for cybersecurity?
Sure. So, kind of their role, I want to reiterate this and reiterate this.
Sure.
There really should be a shared responsibility across the cyber value chain.
Hmm.
And I think that a place is certainly the federal government plays, but it's also vendors, it's
Yeah,
also the enterprise. And so
absolutely.
for me, I believe that the federal government's role is really to ensure, since right now we're still in this place where we have reactive security, and
Hmm.
security is being invested in due to regulation, then
Right.
there has to be some type of responsibility for regulation to be right fitted, and for the government to play this role between, again, industry and the vendors to understand what that means, how regulation can be implemented,
Hmm.
how do we translate these requirements into technical requirements, what is
Right.
possible and technically feasible. So
Right.
it's really to be, I think, to kind of set a corner post of what are those basic security baselines,
Yeah.
and then to help facilitate information sharing across sectors. And, I don't, people are going to argue with me probably on this topic, but, there's a big, again, I'm going to bring it back to the critical infrastructure space, or,
Yep.
even in the financial service space, then there's always that reluctance to share with different federal entities because of, what is a penalty going to look like, what's a fine going to look like if,
True.
there was a specific control. I think that we have to rethink that a little bit. And I think that we have to rethink what those disciplinary actions look like from the federal
Yeah.
government so we can encourage that information sharing. But I don't want to get too down in the details here.
Well, and you had mentioned obviously during the earlier part of that statement was, the current environment lives more of like a reactive state. So
Mhm.
one of the things that I think is going to further emphasize that is this onset of artificial intelligence, chat GPT, all these different tools that now we're in this hurry up and race to the finish because chat GPT was the first, arguably. Um, I think that there's going to be a lot of cybersecurity implications that result of that. I'd be curious what your thoughts in terms of this advent and this more leaning towards the utilization of AI into the mainstream. What does that mean from a cybersecurity landscape aspect?
Sure. And I do want to talk about that reactive active a little bit more. So we'll have to get to
Sure.
it. But I just gave this talk at B-Sides actually in Tulsa.
Okay.
And, to keep it interesting, it was called Can I Punch You in the Face? And you're like, of course not, Madison. But the idea is for us to kind of start thinking about, am I ready to receive that punch in the face, and can I actually withstand it? And
Okay.
part of that conversation was talking about emerging technology and how we can prepare and
Yeah.
use these emerging technologies and not see them just as something that we are trying to defend against, but how we can use them as a defense mechanism. Because
Fair.
it's not as if the attackers have, a different levels of capabilities. Sure, maybe from your standard enterprise,
Yeah.
but for Chat GPT specifically, how I see changing the threat landscape is, I mean, we have to kind of change the mindset. We have very sophisticated attackers. I mean, they have corporate
Hmm.
offices and Slack channels
Absolutely.
and things of that nature, right?
They
And
have
so
I hate
what
Mondays cat posters.
exactly, exactly. And they share all the memes. But what it's going to allow is for less training, less investment in attackers,
Yeah.
because they're going to be able to use ChatGPT to basically retool rapidly once they
Yeah.
get burned, they're going to be able to say, hey, write this line of code to defend or to subvert these types of
Sure.
controls or this piece of technology. And they're going to be able to do that very, very quickly without having to really understand perhaps every level of depth of, let's say, a CrowdStrike. And I'm not trying to call them out
Yeah.
specifically, but just using them
It's
as an
just a more
example
familiar
since we all
term.
know.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's the way that I see ChatGPT used. I think we're going to see much more tailored phishing campaigns, and obviously
Yeah.
they're going to be easier. Same with like more sophisticated ransomware. I think what scares me more than perhaps AI is, the point that quantum computing gets
Okay.
commercialized. Right
Okay.
now, it's the conversation of, well, what does that even mean and what does that look like?
Right.
But it is going to look like a game of rock'em sock'em robots where you see, actual computers fighting against one another or playing a
Mm-hmm.
game of like cat and mouse within our systems. And I envision it like Tron. You see these two red and this like blue light moving through a
Right.
cityscape, but changing that to our systems. And what does quantum encryption look like? And
Right.
so that worries me more than AI.
Okay.
Your audience may want to have a broader conversation about that, but that's the world that I'm not sure if I'm looking forward to it, but I think that we must think
More
about.
cognizant of, for sure. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So, when we first spoke, you kind of touched on the fact that, there's been a knowledge shift, and it's been a massive knowledge shift for the better in terms of where businesses had been versus where they are now. But there's still obviously a lot of room for growth in the cybersecurity space. So for the conventional business owner, I'm just going to throw out a very general, let's say they're a 50-person law firm, healthcare manufacturer. What are some of the business tools that they have to have, and what are some recommendations that you would have that would be more in that nice to have category?
Sure. So I would say have to have backups
Yeah.
because it is going to be, and I know I'm kind of starting at the end. And when I say starting at the end, and I say that if you think about like NIST, the cyber
Mm-hmm.
defense model, right?
Mm-hmm.
Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover.
Right.
As a former incident response person, then I'm like, okay, if something happens, the shit
Right.
hits the fan, if I'm allowed to say that, then, are we prepared to bring systems back up as quickly as possible? Or if
Sure.
just something malfunctions and you need to reset a
Yeah.
server or, whatever that may be. So I think backup and restore is non-negotiable. I think
Yep.
your basic policies and procedures are non-negotiable.
Right.
And that socialization aspect, when you think about a business, then we know, like within the cybersecurity landscape, then, yes, you have a huge attack surface, but we know
Mm-hmm.
that people are the weakest link.
Right.
So, with that being said, then I think education and awareness is,
Absolutely.
an absolute must.
Yeah.
If we think about that identity piece, then it's understanding what's normal, and so I think that's
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, and
Yeah.
understanding like your own risk tolerance. Getting more technical. I think that it's critical for any organization to have a basic, monitoring capabilities, asset management capabilities,
Yep.
and that's kind of, you know, really kind of walks a line between identity and I do not want to say protect because I do not believe that visibility is a protection
Okay.
mechanism. It is a
Okay.
detection mechanism and still sits in that reactive category of security.
Okay.
So I think those are the basics. I know this doesn't dive deep, but access
Sure.
controls,
Yeah.
user definitions, all
Yeah.
of those are basic. Multi-factor authentication, VPNs,
Correct.
monitoring of your vendors.
Correct.
Those to me are baseline cyber hygiene. And I think if we can just get organizations, if we're talking about 100-person shop, then
Mm-hmm.
that would to me would be a good robust capability for a 100-person shop.
Yeah.
I think that's what's manageable with new technology coming in every single day. I just don't know if they would have that ability in house. So that's probably where they need to lean on a managed service if they have a
Yep.
budget.
Right.
But a lot of that can be a light lift from internal folks.
Yeah. And, I agree with you wholeheartedly on all of those things. One of the things that I think that sets our organization apart from a number of other similar managed service providers is we roll in cybersecurity training on a monthly basis, come standard for all of our clients, because we just believe so fervently in your people are your weakest link as much as they are, the backbone of your organization. They're also the people that are going to want to click on that link. And so if we're not training them effectively, how to work out of a Starbucks or what have you, how to know what's a safe email and what's not a safe email, how to know how to access and share
Mhm.
files, you're just doing yourself a disservice. So I couldn't agree with you more on that, obviously, as well. Um, so, the incident response plan that the incident response environment that you'd worked in previously, and kind of having worked in that cybersecurity space, what is an incident response plan, or what is a security response plan, and how does it truly help my company be successful?
Mhm. So I think about this in like a two prong, and like I love the people element of cybersecurity for a number of reasons.
Right.
But I think this is two prong. I mean, you can't have everyone's like, oh, I need to have this like complex, incident response plan. And like I would come in and be like, great, this huge book is fantastic, but who
Right.
knows this damn thing? Right?
Correct.
No one is
Correct.
going to. And it's a great reference point. But I think something that
And
is
when you need
basic.
it, who's going to remember to open that up and remember how it's
Oh,
all structured?
yeah, no one's gonna even know where to find it, probably. I'm just kidding. I would hope not. Do not take that as a recommendation.
No, no, yeah.
Um, yeah, so basics. You need to have your basic incident response plan of what happens, who are the people that engage, do these individuals know? And I know that's around the awareness element,
Right.
but it really does need to be thorough on just when the appropriate handoffs are, especially when it comes to legal, because chain of
Yeah.
custody is so, 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 so important. When you get your higher executives involved, what tools that you need to include throughout those processes,
Yeah.
who has ownership of those tools, I think is critical. And to me, that's just to ensure that you're not stepping on each other's toes. And so I think clear delineation between assignments is
Right.
critical. And again, those handoffs, you're not going to be able to write an incident response playbook for every single scenario.
Right.
And so to me, it's just making sure that teams can move fluidly and
Yeah.
that individuals aren't panicking because they had no idea, what they were actually stepping into.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want to say that it's less about the plan, but individuals feeling comfortable and knowing that they have a role within that
Right.
process when the shit does hit the fan. And it
Right.
is a win. It is not an if.
Correct.
um, I think it's also really important to understand those escalations. When do you get certain people involved based on, is
Sure.
it a benign data breach that maybe it was just, maybe a couple of internal emails that were, leaked. How
Right.
sensitive was it?
Right.
Was it client information? Was it HIPAA data?
Yeah.
Really understanding so that you don't potentially overreact and kind of create this like your own PR nightmare, or
Right.
you overreact and kind of create an alarm internally so that people can't kind of kind of calm and set that pace and understanding what it actually takes to understand what happened.
Yeah. No, that's outstanding. And I think, having that structure and having that ability to know whose responsibilities are where is hugely critical and obviously very important. Because I'm sure in that moment there's a lot of chaos, and so I think that's outstanding advice. Um, can you talk a little bit more about what goes into I'm an organization. I haven't yet had a breach that I'm aware of, or a massive breach that I'm aware of, but I'm curious in terms of what should I be looking for and what things should I be potentially concerned about? Maybe I want to set up a vulnerability assessment. What does that look like? How does that help my company? How do I even go about engaging in that process?
Sure. So, this is always about, kind of going back earlier to what is your risk profile?
Right.
What are the assets that you've defined critical? That high, medium, low, right? You got to
Sure.
have the basics, and then whether you have a vulnerability scanner that you're using, like a Tenable or just some type of vulnerability
Yeah.
management
Yeah.
tool. This doesn't necessarily have to be, some people like to do this manually, which is insane, but that's a whole other conversation. Um, you know, to me, that should be starting on your critical assets or just
Okay.
critical vulnerabilities that are being published. But what I
Yeah.
want to more so emphasize is that remediation phase,
Yeah.
because you're going to discover vulnerabilities on your systems every single day, potentially, most
Yeah.
likely. And
Yeah.
so, what is that remediation process? And you're going to hear me. I'm I'm an operations person. That's how I
Okay.
work. I'm a process flow orientated person.
Sure.
And so when anyone starts talking to me about, vulnerabilities or risk mitigation, then I'm like, okay, who's owning? What's your tracking mechanisms?
Yeah.
How do you know something was remediated in the environment? How do you know where this vulnerability lies within your environment? Because something could, you know, be flagged from Microsoft and say, hey, this is critical. But if you don't even know if it's in your environment, then it's irrelevant.
Right.
So it's, understanding, sure, it might be critical to Microsoft, but is it really critical to your organization and being able to define that?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to be kind of this way at the mercy more so of other organizations versus what
Right.
you're dictating for yourself. And so I think that that's important. And those are all things that are manageable
Hmm.
via classification and a tool. So I guess that's my thoughts. Yeah,
Fair enough. No, that's fine. Yeah, I think it's just you know, trying to what I think is important is that you and I are trying to help bridge that knowledge gap that so many businesses have. And so oftentimes they hear these terms and they hear this jargon and they say, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's relevant. I don't know if it's necessary for me. I'm just kind of left to shrug my shoulders and either A, put my head in the sand and just keep operating, or B,
sure,
I go way too far into the deep end and then I'm spending, I'm reading, these books that are extensive and trying to just become this expert. And so it's all about kind of finding that fine line between efficiencies and being able to make sure that organizations are set up for success.
sure.
So with that kind of being said, from your security background and from your security experience, what are some, and I know we spoke about this in some ways already, kind of in making sure that you have effective backups, but what are some best practice standards for securing data, such as customer info, financial records, trade secrets, what have you?
Sure. So you talked about the protection level or
Right.
backups. Critical logging is critical. And again,
Okay.
this is just so that when something does happen, and I hate to say it, but it really is
When? Yeah.
that unfortunate win, then you can actually do that post-mortem. You can actually
Okay.
understand some of the movement or any type of extraction or data manipulation that's happened in the environment. So that is critical. But, before that point, you asked about the protection layers. I mean,
Hmm.
segmentation, whether that
Absolutely.
is internal data, external data, different departments, who truly needs access on what type of time frame do they need access.
Right.
And when I say time frame, I am talking about vendors,
Yeah.
which is becoming, kind of a sore spot. That second kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like highest attack rate is our third party vendors.
Right.
And it's
Right.
just because we forget that, oh, we have this workstation that we allow Joe to use when he comes in on Patch Friday.
Right.
And, we forget to, uh, you know, restrict his access Monday through Thursday, right? And
Yeah.
it's not monitored.
Right.
So it's just critical to understand who has access, who's able to view data, who's able to make changes. What do your data flows look like? Are you
Hmm.
storing it? What does your encryption levels look like? it's the full, pipeline of what and where your data is going.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that you have more horror stories than I could ever imagine, but I've known enough in, my 3 years of working in the managed services space and the IT support space. I've seen a number of situations where, like you mentioned, that no one touches that computer. And so but it's connected to the network. It has all the capabilities and all the access, but for, 30 minutes a month, 30 minutes a week that someone's interfacing with it. And you just, whether it's even just a computer or user profiles, all those kinds of things are just these constant threat vectors that are coming in that if they're not properly addressed, monitored, and maintained, you're just leaving yourself out there and crossing your fingers and toes. And unfortunately, with you kind of making the emphasis on it's not if, it's when, we're not that lucky.
Yeah. And it's so funny. This goes back to our earlier conversation, those workstations, that do have, elite privilege.
Yeah.
I'll say elite, privilege are purely stood up for convenience.
Yeah.
We talked about before, it's a business operations versus necessarily security. And
Mm-hmm.
so, there is a way to design your architecture and so that it is secured by design.
Right.
I love the fact that the new White House strategy really emphasizes this whole concept. And
Yeah.
so,
Absolutely.
I think that we have to get away from this idea that security is an impeding factor to the business,
Right.
but it is more so a major pillar to the business.
Correct.
Again, within the critical infrastructure space, then we talk about, reliability and safety. Those are like the two biggest pillars within the
Mm-hmm.
mission within critical infrastructure. What we don't think about is cybersecurity is a major factor in impeding it. And
Right.
so, how do they work together? And I think we're getting closer to it.
Yeah.
But we still kind of get in our way with the technical jargon and just the misunderstandings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still so many people that view it strictly as a cost center as opposed to understanding truly what it's designed and built to do, for sure.
Right. That
Um,
insurance policy, right?
yes. Any other thoughts or comments or things you want to share?
Um, I didn't mention this whole reactive active security
Hmm.
posture, and maybe it's for our next discussion, but just taking, 15 seconds, maybe, you
Absolutely.
know, I think reactive security is this old school type of security that we have been traditionally accustomed to, and we're still
Yeah.
trying to catch up to. And that's that cyber hygiene of thinking about, visibility is a reactive nature. It's to
Yeah.
understand if something happens and can you find it, would you be able to extract it, and to me
Yeah.
that is reactive security.
Okay.
And so when we talk about active prevention mechanisms,
Sure.
then we're really articulating what that means, because I think too often in the industry then the C-suite or a frontline manager says, oh, we
Right.
have all these tools, and then we still get popped. But
Yeah.
it's a lack of understanding that those visibility tools, those EDRs, are not a prevention layer. And
Right.
so thinking more about secure by design concepts, zero
Okay.
trust,
Yeah.
and how to slow an attacker down, or prevent even access to those most critical systems, I think is
Right.
a change of mindset that the industry is adopting. But to
Okay.
me, active security is back to those baseline hygiene type of security measures.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I would love to kind of go a little bit further into that and have that a little bit more of a focused and intentional conversation. I think that would be a great
So,
value add for so many people to understand because, yeah, you're right. So oftentimes when someone looks at understanding cybersecurity, it is based off of, well, what happens when someone's in there?
mhm.
And, having that proactive or that more active approach in terms of what are the measures that we can do to further prevent someone from getting in there is critical and is hugely important.
Mhm, mhm.
So Rose Rock Advisory, obviously it's an organization you've founded and you're CEO of. How can they get in contact with you if they have more questions specifically about cybersecurity, how it's relevant to their business?
Sure, absolutely. So super easy. You can reach out to us at info@roserock.com. group, grp.com. It's abbreviated. Obviously, our website is, you're more than welcome to explore there. Very accessible, so feel free to reach out.